Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. Over there, over there.
Welcome to Theology in Perspective, the Bible teaching ministry of Dr. Daniel Woodhead.
Welcome back to Theology in Perspective. I'm Dr. Daniel Woodhead, and I'm blessed you could join us again today. We're continuing our study in part 2 of the illegal trials of Jesus, all 6 of them, if you will. And I want to start where he's in front of the Sanhedrin, and they're looking for witnesses because, 1, they haven't charged him, and 2, there are no eyewitnesses to any criminal activity on the part of Jesus. Now, Mark 14, verses 57 to 59, discuss a search for and how they find these people, these false witnesses, as it were. In the text there it says, "And there arose certain and bear false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple and that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made with hands. But neither so did their witnesses agree to one another." They don't agree with each other. You know, one says, "Oh, no, he did this." Well, no, he didn't. He did that. Finally, they find some witnesses to testify against Jesus with lies, and they twist what he said about his death and resurrection. He's talking about this temple of our bodies. If he had truly said anything about the material, the real Jewish temple, the Romans would have charged him with a capital crime. These witnesses could also not agree amongst themselves. So here's what happens. Caiaphas, the high priest, intervenes. And the text goes on, it says, "And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses against thee? But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." Now Caiaphas is getting frustrated with this whole process here. And although it was highly illegal, and he wasn't getting anywhere because there's no charges. So they now try to get Jesus or coerce him into incriminating himself. They don't realize Jesus is God. They had tried, and they failed on many occasions to trap Jesus for the last year or so, and specifically this last week when he was in Jerusalem. But they were unable to do so with their own trick questions. So Caiaphas, he demands that Jesus answer his accusers, and he explains the accusation against him from these false witnesses. But Jesus doesn't say anything. He just holds his peace and says nothing. He's not going to respond to this nonsense. And the proceedings came to a halt right there. Caiaphas just seems to switch tactics, looking for a chargeable offense. And at this point, he says, Jesus, art thou the Son of the Christ, Son of the Blessed? Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And even though the authorities were violating the law, Jesus would not violate it. He didn't answer the first question, but he will answer the second one. Jesus was put under oath, and that forced Jesus to answer under the Mosaic law, Leviticus 5:1, and Matthew 26:63. Jesus would be forced to incriminate himself by answering question number 2, which was related to the law. So, violation 4. The condemnation sentence was pronounced against Jesus by the Sanhedrin, and it was founded upon this uncorroborated confession. The law says no one can bring an accusation against himself. Should a man make a confession of guilt before a legally constituted tribunal, such confession is not to be said against him unless properly attested by 2 witnesses. So, no attempt can be made to lead a man on to self-incrimination. A voluntary confession on his part is not admitted in evidence, and therefore not competent to convict him unless a legal number of witnesses minutely corroborate this self-accusation. So Jesus was convicted and condemned to death on legally inadmissible evidence. It was at first that they sought to condemn him to death on legally inadmissible evidence on the charge of sedition. But their witnesses couldn't come together. They couldn't come together because he hadn't done anything. But instead of releasing Jesus, the judges, in total disregard of the law, they turned to the accused and they asked, "You're not answering anything? What these witnesses said about you?" He just holds his peace and he doesn't say anything. But by remaining silent, Jesus was invoking the right against self-incrimination. Caiaphas insisted that Jesus incriminate himself. So Jesus, in accordance with the law in Leviticus 5:1, says to Caiaphas' question about Jesus' deity, and Jesus said, "I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." He's simply telling them who he is, and he's affirming Psalm 110:1 as the Son of Man sitting at God's right hand and coming on clouds. Again, that refers to Daniel 7:13-14, Acts 1:9-11, and what we see in Revelation chapter 19. Well, Caiaphas is listening to all this, and he's had enough now. He's seeing, now we got him on blasphemy, claiming himself to be one with God. And the high priest rents his clothes and saith, "What need we any further witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. What think ye?" And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to buffet him and say unto him, "Prophesy." And the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. By tearing his clothes, Caiaphas showed that he regarded Jesus' admission of who he is as blasphemy. To him, Jesus' words dishonored God by claiming rights and powers that belong exclusively to God, and his expression of horror and indignation was all symbolism, which was required of the high priest whenever he heard blasphemy. So he tears his clothes and he's, "Oh, I'm grieved," and all that. And it was just a show. It was just a show. Since Jesus self-incriminating himself, there was no need for any more witnesses, and the Mosaic law prescribed death by stoning for blasphemy. That's Leviticus 24, verses 15-16. So without any further investigation, the high priest calls for a verdict from the Sanhedrin. There were no objections. They all condemned him as worthy of death, and with this admission and this faked expression of indignation by Caiaphas, some members start to hit him and they blindfold him and they spit on him and they strike him and so on. Tell him to prophesy if you're the Messiah. And the next morning, and remember now, this is Gethsemane and then this trial at night. And the next morning, the chief priests hold a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus, and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate. Now, bear in mind now, the Romans would not let the Jews conduct capital punishment. So they had to go to the Romans to get approval for this. And they were going to petition to have the Romans execute him. So they carried him away and they delivered him to Pilate. If the Romans would execute him, the people wouldn't be able to riot because it would be their own people that was doing this. And the Romans had control over this, and they would stop any insurrection that happened if it broke out. So Pilate, the local ethnarch, if you will, they representative, if you will, from Rome, he was woken to the sounds of an angry mob outside his house, and he couldn't affirm or rescind the Sanhedrin's death sentence. And now if the Jewish verdict was rescinded, a new trial before a Roman court was ordered and scheduled, and the trial of the Sanhedrin would have to prove, the Sanhedrin, during this trial, this Roman trial, we're going to have to prove a committed capital crime under Roman law, not Jewish law. The Sanhedrin conviction of blasphemy was not a charge the Romans cared about. Because of that, the Sanhedrin substituted a charge of treason, using Jesus' acknowledgement that he was the Messiah into a traitorous political charge, saying, he claims to be the king of the Jews. And they tried to convince the Romans that Jesus was a traitor, and this king he claimed to be was a potential insurrectionist and a real threat here to the peace of Rome, the Pax Romana. Pontius Pilate was a Roman governor in Samaria and Judea. They call it the West Bank today, from about AD 26 to 36. Not long, 10 years. And Jerusalem was located in Judea. His normal residence was on Caesarea on the Mediterranean Sea, but he was in Jerusalem for the Passover. Big party, so many people there. And at that time, there were thousands of Jewish pilgrims in Jerusalem. And the influx of the worshipers there was stronger. There was a stronger chance of rioting during that time. So he stayed in a place called the Praetorium, which was the Jerusalem headquarters that he had there. He didn't have any love for the Jews, and the attitude was mutual. Nobody liked him either. But you got this tension, and they're bringing this guy, this Jesus, to him for a decision to execute. And he says to them, art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus answering him, you said it. And the chief priest accused him of many things, but he didn't answer anything. Now, he's got this new charge now in front of Pilate, king of the Jews. This trial would normally be held outdoors in the public, but it was in the magistrates' and inner area there. And as soon as the magistrate had heard all the evidence, he would render a verdict and immediately follow with a sentence, which would be carried out quickly. There wasn't any appeal. The Sanhedrin had issued a death sentence for blasphemy, but it got changed to treason for Pilate because Pilate, again, he didn't care about the Sanhedrin's sentence of some religious infraction. He wanted to hear the testimonies himself. So, again, he said, you king of the Jews? And he says, yeah, I am king of the Jews. Well, Pilate still didn't see any immediate problem with this. He could see that the Sanhedrin had a weak case, but there's no threat with this guy starting a rebellion. And the Sanhedrin pushed and pushed and pushed. And he knew the charges were weak and probably even false, and he expected Jesus to say something in his own defense, but he didn't say anything. And that's as prophesied from Isaiah 53:7. And they begin to accuse him. They begin to accuse him. We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king. So that now the charges are getting more formal. Perverting the nation, forbidding others to give tribute, taxes to Caesar, making himself to be a king. So Jesus had no reason to delay the execution, given that it was the reason that he came to earth to die for the sins of mankind. And now we're getting into the day of Passover. We're not there yet, almost. Remember, it's the evening. And Pilate found out that Jesus was a Galilean, so he sends him over to Herod. He said, let him deal with it. I don't want to deal with this guy. So Herod Antipas was the tetrarch of Galilee, and he was also in Jerusalem for the Passover. Herod had Jesus dressed as a false king and demanded that he perform some miracle. He only mocked Jesus, and then he sent him back to Pilate. He didn't want to deal with it either, because there's no case. And Pilate asked him, saying, don't you have anything to say? Answer any of these? Behold, how many things these witnesses have said against you. And Jesus still doesn't answer. And Pilate's just marveling at this. This guy says nothing. And he realized that there were bad charges here. Now, the religious leaders bring a lot of charges against Jesus. None of them are clear. And Pilate figures this out. He sees that this is jealousy and hatred. And he also sees that Jesus is very popular. And the charges themselves really impress Pilate, much less than Jesus' confident silence. So Pilate continues to be amazed here at Jesus' remaining silence, and he sees so much envy and hatred directed towards him. Pilate decides, I think we'll release this guy. And he says, now at the feast, he released unto them one prisoner, whomever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that had made insurrection and had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done to them. But Pilate answered, saying, will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? And each of the four Gospels tell how hard Pilate tried to avoid condemning Jesus. Pilate sends Jesus to Herod as a courtesy that he appreciated, and they became close friends as a result of this. And then coupled with the fact that Pilate's wife had warned him not to harm this man because he's innocent. Now, so Pilate is really uncomfortable about having Jesus executed. Pilate's wife had a dream, and it really frightened her. And as a result, she sends a message to Pilate while he's in the praetorium with Jesus and the angry crowd. And when he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sends to him, saying, have thou nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. Pilate's got to be upset now. In order to try and please the Jews somewhat, the Romans had a practice of releasing one prisoner at Passover. That's what Caiaphas was referring to earlier. The Jews had come to expect this, and they thought it was their custom. It's really Roman custom. This was no more than a goodwill custom of the Roman governor in Judea, in furtherance, if you will, of the Pax Romana over a conquered and occupied nation. So instead of granting Jesus an acquittal, Pilate chose to grant the customary Passover amnesty, thinking the people would request the release of Jesus. And together with Jesus in the praetorium was this criminal, a known criminal named Barabbas. And he was a known freedom fighter and a murderer. He'd stirred up so much opposition towards Rome and was known as an insurrectionist. He was waiting the order of execution from Pilate, and he expected it. While he was a criminal to Rome, many of the Jews regarded him as a hero trying to throw off the yoke of enslavement of the occupiers of the Jews, the Romans. Now, the crowd had assembled at his palace, and though the group of Jewish religious leaders were not favorable toward Jesus and wanted to get rid of him, we know that now, he exposed their chicanery. The Lord Jesus did in the spiritual enslavement. They put the common Jews in with the rabbinic law. They violated the Torah. They violated the Mosaic law. They built their own law. And what they had built was just terrible to the people. They also didn't recognize that Jesus was the Messiah. And the crowd was being excited by the chief priests and chanting for Pilate to release them. One criminal. We want to see somebody released. And they had come to see Jesus executed. Pilate, wanting to not execute Jesus, says, would you prefer that I release unto you the King of the Jews? And he did not expect their response. For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the people. They incited the people that he should rather release Barabbas, unto them. Pilate was well aware of the envy of the chief priest, and he knew what they were wanting to do. But he wanted to avoid this, but the crowd starts chanting. And in the trial before Pilate, the opposition to Jesus came largely from the Sanhedrin. The actual arrest and the trial of Jesus, the text in Mark shows us that was the responsibility of the high priest. And the prime mover in Jesus' trial is the high priest. And this is the guy, Caiaphas. He stirs up the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas. And the crowd starts demanding that Barabbas gets released. And Pilate answered and said unto them, from Mark 15:12-14, what will ye then I should do unto him who you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out, crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, why, what evil hath he done? And they cried out even the more exceedingly, crucify him. Pilate is now really in a quandary. He's got this warning of his wife. He knew Jesus is innocent. And he just doesn't understand why Jesus doesn't defend himself. And in sort of a mocking way, he's saying, him who you call the King of the Jews. These verses show us how Mark, the writer here, focuses on the culpability of the religious leaders in Jesus' execution. And when their efforts to have Jesus killed appeared to be stopped by Pilate, the religious leaders persuaded the crowd to cry out loudly to crucify him. You know, the plot would never have worked with the huge crowds that loved and followed Jesus. It was only because he had been so popular that the religious leaders were prevented from moving against him earlier, or they would have in that last week. They had to conduct an illegal trial at night, 3 of them, if you will. 3 of them. His supporters were unaware of what had transpired. Their plot against Jesus was also aimed at placing the blame on the Romans. Pilate ruled as governor in an out-of-the-way region, and according to Rome, it was just of minor importance. They only provided him with a small army. That put him at a disadvantage, too, if the Jews actually rebelled. So he had to do whatever he could to maintain the peace, or he may incur the wrath of the emperor in Rome. So although he did not see any reason to kill Jesus, he went along with them because they threatened to report him to Tiberius Caesar. That's from John 19:12. And if they did that and rioted, his career was going to be really limited or ended. Pilate did not need a riot at Passover with thousands of people there. And he's asking them, what evil has this guy done? So he releases Barabbas, and Jesus becomes the substitutionary lamb that takes away the sins of the world. Now, you know what's really interesting? When the religious leaders, they took full responsibility for his death and resurrection, because they said to Pilate, his blood be on us and on our children. We have no king but Caesar. John 19:15. Ooh, ooh, ooh. That's how ignorant these people were of the truth. Ignorant of their own scriptures. Pilate then delivers Jesus to have him scourged and to be crucified. So the last of the 6 trials, if you will, 3 civil, 3 religious, ends with Pilate wanting to appease the angry crowds more than he does to administer justice. If Pilate wanted to release Jesus, it wasn't going to happen without a riot in his mind. He knew they had no sustainable charge against Jesus, so he washes his hands in the matter and thinking, my guilt's gone, man. I don't have anything to do with this. And he thought, I got good reason to do this because it's a political appeasement of the crowd. I'm avoiding a riot. I don't want to anger Caesar. So he releases the criminal Barabbas and has Jesus flogged. Now, Pilate had Jesus flogged in hope that the people would take pity and be satisfied. The flogging didn't move them at all. They still insisted he be crucified. And what did he do? He sends him to the cross. And it was done with a multi-stranded whip. And it was like a leather or a wood pole. It's only about maybe 18 inches long. Leather straps, a number of them, maybe 10 or 12. At the end were sharp pieces of metal or bones or pottery. And several soldiers would carry out this flogging. And then we see that he was hanged on the tree and he died. So what is important for us to see here? One, Jesus died for the sins of this world, and it was sinful people that took him down. There's lots of discussion of, did Jesus orchestrate these events, or did Jesus just allow the sinful people to do what sinful people do? It happened, and the illegal trials were very, very well known, and these people in their envy and their hatred could not care. It's important for us to see that. This is how the world deals with situations. We have laws, we have rules, we have moral standards, but those that want to take us down for whatever reason will do so. They will not care of what it is that is true. They'll do things for expediency, to satisfy something other than truth, facts, and adherence to the law. We need to pay attention to this because this is coming on this earth to the Christian folks as the societies get increasingly more corrupt. There's more insurrections taking place. There's more wars. This is what happens, that the society crumbles, the law is no longer adhered to, and the jealousy and the animosity between people cause these things to come about. The good news for us is Jesus died. He rose from the dead 3 days later, and if you believe that historic fact, you will be with me in heaven when we leave these bodies, and everybody leaves these bodies. No one stays here. We all know that. We all know the graveyards are filled, that people live for a certain amount of time and then the bodies perish. But Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No man comes unto the Father except through me. God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you in our next session.
We hope you have been blessed by this message today on a contemporarily relevant Bible topic. Dr. Woodhead has been teaching the Bible for 25 years. He is a pastor, an author, and conference speaker on various biblical subjects. Dr. Woodhead is the Dean of the Jewish Studies School at Schofield Seminary. His seminary teaching includes the Old Testament and Biblical Hebrew. He has attended Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a Hebrew College in Massachusetts. Let us know if you have any questions about today's broadcast. We look forward to providing you with continuing Bible messages each week on this station. God bless you.